Welcome. Good afternoon, evening. I'm Karen Engel, and I teach here at the law school, and I co-direct the Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. And I would do a land acknowledgement if I had known that I was opening the event, and I don't have it memorized, so I'll just say I want to recognize and acknowledge all the indigenous peoples who preceded us on this land. It's a delight this evening to have Albena Azmanova here. We've had her here on Zoom, but not in person. 2 years ago for a terrific pop-up institute that we did sort of mid-COVID. And am very grateful to Jamie Galbraith for introducing us to Albena's work and then staying on top of it and then helping to bring her here. So we've co-sponsored this event with the LBJ School, and I'm sure that the Lloyd Benson Chair, and I will let you take it from here.
Well, in my turn, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Albena Azmanova. And I'll just say a few words about her background. She was born and raised in Bulgaria in the socialist era. Spent part of her childhood in Algeria, where her father was sent on some official pretext and then ended up opening a sculpture school. In her adolescence, she had fairly decent skills with an AK-47 and learned that involvement even with the incipient environmental concerns of that time would get you in trouble with the security services of the Bulgarian equivalent of the Stasi. And ultimately she made her way from there to the United States to earn a PhD at the New School. And finally, after a number of different detours, to Brussels, where she has been for a number of years as now a professor and chair at the School of International Studies of the University of Kent at Brussels. She has a rising and now really quite vast reputation as a philosopher and social critic. That was created in the first instance by her book, The Scandal of Reason, and most recently, around 2019, I think, 2020, by the publication of Capitalism on Edge, which came to my attention, frankly, from a cold email saying, would you have a look at this, and led me to be really so deeply impressed with her work. So I prepared a review, which I'm very proud to say was the first review to be published by the Democracy Journal, edited by Michael Tomasky. And that book then has had really quite a sensational career, winning, I think, 3 substantial prizes from in international political economy and related disciplines, including the Michael Harrington Award. I have had the privilege of being in contact with Albena on quite frequent basis and co-authoring an occasional short piece, working together. As Karen said, it was my great pleasure to be able to bring her here virtually a couple of years ago, and now taking advantage of a trip that she had arranged to come and speak at a symposium of the Open University on Economic Democracy Initiative in New York. I jumped on the opportunity and said, why don't you come down and give a talk here at the Rappaport Center, and with, again, Karen and Neville's very gracious cooperation, here we are. So it really is my tremendous pleasure to introduce my friend, philosopher, social critic, Professor Albena Azmanova.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you all for coming. Of course, it's an honor, but let me say also, it's a joy to be here. I've met some of you already 2 years ago, and we have bonded, and it makes sense finally to come, live here. So my academic work of recent years has been kind of schizophrenic. I have worked on issues of economic insecurity, but including policy reports I've done for the European Parliament. And then I've done, in a separate track, completely separate track, work on law, on human rights. So this invitation at the Rappaport Center, I thought I want to see how the two actually tracks intersect. Is there a common dynamic between the two? And I have come up with a proposal. Let me see what you would think about it. And my entry point is to look at the debate on social justice in the past, let's say, 20 years. So two developments, two measurable social facts have held our attention, at least since, that year of, annus horribilis 2008, the financial meltdown. The one is the growth of inequality, and the other is the growth of far-right populism, whose trademark feature is xenophobia, fear and hatred of strangers, right? So these developments have been central to debates on social justice and electoral politics, at least for good 15 years. Indeed, no wonder. The Great Recession pushed inequalities upwards, both for the EU as a whole and among most member states. As my talk is advertised, I will speak about Europe. You can draw your conclusions for the US. I think it's not that different, but I will stick to Europe. So this is according to the 2023, the most recent report of the European Commission Statistical Office. Okay, so inequality is indeed rising. In Italy, over 90% of the population agree that income disparities are too large. The OECD average is 80%. So it seems that it matters to people when you ask them. The Brothers of Italy, a party with neo-fascist roots, formed a government a year ago. In Sweden, a hard-right group founded by neo-Nazis and skinheads, the Sweden Democrats, won the second highest number of seats in parliament in elections 2 years ago. And it goes on everywhere you look in Europe. The far-right forces have made gains through the channels of electoral politics. Finland, Austria, Germany, France, Spain, Greece. Yeah. So I will argue, however, that the growth of inequality and the rise of the far right, even though they might be statistically correlated, the former is not causing the latter. The rise of inequality and the far right are actually, I would suggest, they are symptoms of something else. The emergence of two larger social epidemics. On the one hand, the rise of widespread economic and social insecurity, but a particular version of it that I will describe as precarity. I'll try to convince you that we need a new word for that. And that insecurity goes beyond the impoverished working classes. And on the other hand, the other phenomenon, parallel phenomenon, is the rise of autocratic rule in Europe within the centrist parties. This is pushed by the centrist parties. So two phenomena that I will claim are in a relation of mutual causation. So this would be the key takeaway of my talk, that certain politics and policies, which I will review somewhat, are generating ubiquitous insecurity, which is in turn generating appetites for autocratic instant security and stability measures. But autocratic rule in turn deepens precarity as it undermines political freedoms and disempowers us. So if economic insecurity disempowers us, then crash on basic freedoms also disempowers us. So that is, economic insecurity and autocracy are mutually reinforcing dynamics that are reshaping, or rather mutilating, European societies. In my work, I describe precarity as a special a peculiar form of insecurity. I mean, insecurity is a trademark feature of modernities, but we cannot say that it's unavoidable because there is a certain kind of insecurity of livelihoods that is rooted in specific policies, so it's politically engineered, a condition of responsibility without power, and we will see how we get there, how we get to increased responsibilization of individuals in society without really giving them the means to carry on that responsibility. Its corollary to responsibility without power is power without responsibility, autocracy. So this is not an exceptional, so this is kind of the philosophical hook, if you wish, the sketch of conceptualization. And I'm going to claim that this is not an exceptional state of affairs. We do not see it only on the fringes, only on the impoverished working class, only on far-right parties bringing this in. This is not an anomaly. In Europe, this is becoming the new normal. But and this is what we need to research, these interlocking dynamics, but being narrowly focused on the rise of inequality and the far right prevents us actually from seeing these two dangerous dynamics at work between the political economy and the political system of contemporary democracies. So if you allow me, before I jump into the gist of the analysis, I'd like to look at what I'm discarding. Why the two predominant explanations that are focusing on economic parameters and the rise of far-right populism do not hold water. The first one is the story that impoverishment, especially after the financial crisis, fuels anti-establishment insurgency among the working class, moved by cost of living concerns, bread and gasoline concerns. In this story, populist parties surge to power, presenting themselves to be the leaders of a revolt against the elites and the super-rich. The latest version of this story we find in the new book by Julia Cagé and Thomas Piketty, A History of Political Conflict, Elections and Inequalities in France. So that correlation is there in the title, Elections and Inequalities in France, from 1789 to 2022. The book just came out. In France, the authors established the rich vote for the center, low-income urban voters vote predominantly for the left, while working-class voters outside the main cities tend to vote for parties of the far right. So we have a solid materialist explanation focused on measurable economic parameters such as income, wealth, education, and home ownership. Very meticulous analysis they present. However, the diagnosis that rising inequality and impoverishment are somehow significantly correlated or even driving support for the far right looks less convincing if we take into account the following four things. First, typically pundits focused on the period after the 2008 crisis, when indeed massive impoverishment happened. But the rise of far-right populism began much earlier, in the 1990s. So the surge of electoral support for such entities as Austria's Freedom Party and the French Front National happened throughout the 1990s. Those were what Joseph Stiglitz described as the roaring 90s, the good economic growth in most European and in the US countries, in most Western countries. So good, Germany had some trouble back then, but not rising populism. So good economic growth, low unemployment. In fact, the European Parliament, this is when the European Parliament asked me to look into this phenomenon, to research the issue. That was in 2003. There were elections coming in 2004, so they asked me to look into the matter because it seemed very strange, this combination between prosperity and far-right insurgency. So I was kind of lucky that somebody brought to my attention this anomaly. The second fact, many of the supporters of the far right are not the impoverished working class. Éric Zemmour, electorate in France, he describes his electorate as the educated, patriotic bourgeoisie, so the rich. Giorgia Meloni's electorate in Italy are mostly the self-employed, and she did very well in the affluent north. The third fact, why isn't the anti-establishment vote directed against the right? Why isn't the rage of impoverished workers boosting the vote for the left? In very few cases that has been the case, kind of in a limited time in Spain and Greece with the rise of Podemos and Syriza. So the economistic explanation, oh, sorry, I said four, no, there are three facts, enough. So the economistic explanation of taking the correlation between rising inequality and rising far-right populism is not quite convincing. But there is a rival explanation, and that is based on culture. So the first is based on economics, next is based on culture, the cultural backlash. You know, it's a familiar story here. This is the title of a book published in 2019 by Pippa Norris and Ron Inglehart, very esteemed social theorists, social scientists. So there, more or less, the position is that deeply ingrained culture of bigotry, post-colonial remnants of European imperialism akin to the US history of slavery, plus the working class reacting to the liberal left's identity politics and anti-discrimination militancy is driving this backlash. So Pippa Norris and Ron Inglehart argue that as societies become more liberal over time, older, so more liberal culturally, older, more conservative cohorts feel under pressure, feel under threat of losing majority status, allegedly turn towards authoritarian populist parties that promise to stop the tide of liberalism. So that's the cultural explanation. Well, here's some evidence why this doesn't work. How many I have there? 4. Oops, 5. Xenophobia is on the rise in countries with deeply liberal culture, like the Netherlands and Sweden, as well as countries not much exposed to immigration and without a history of colonial expansion in Africa, like Switzerland and Austria. Second, in contrast to what Norris and Inglehart argue, there is no significant polarization of attitudes between younger and older cohorts. This statistically is just not true. The younger cohorts are equally likely to vote for authoritarian populist parties in Europe. Third, Norris and Inglehart describe authoritarian populism as adherence to conventional group norms. They mean traditional conservative cultural values as a backlash to the cultural liberalism of the left. That's their thesis. But many of these movements have a libertarian streak. They espouse selectively some liberal values. Their typical adage is that they're protecting Western liberal culture from Islamic traditionalism. So actually, they defend liberal values. To take the so-called identitarian movement in Europe, these are trans-European hipster right. Its political stance amalgamates features of cultural liberalism and racialized xenophobia into a defense of a European way of life. My doctoral student from Palestine, Azar Dakwar, and I have described this as inverted post-nationalism. It is a territorial and ethnic appropriation of universal political values. These formations are not traditionalist. They typically marry an allegiance to some liberal values, from freedom of speech, very, very big with them, freedom of speech, to gender equality and LGBT rights sometimes, with appeals for social, economic, cultural, and physical safety. Fourth thing to bear in mind, the insurgent far right, in fact, espouses an agenda that cuts across the left and right divide. So it's even confusing to call them far right in many instances, because they're often economically to the left. They want social protection. And then they have this salad of cultural conservatism and cultural liberalism. And fifth, these parties are usually described as autocratic populism. This penchant for autocracy is claimed to be their differentia specifica, their trademark, and to distinguish them from the good democratic populism. But the anti-liberal turn in European politics has been actually performed by mainstream parties. There is a general and persistent tendency of rising arbitrary power in the mature democracies of Europe. We all know about Eastern Europe. I don't have time to address that, but I think those dynamics happened there earlier. They played out earlier. So we see these things happening in the UK, France, the Netherlands. According to the World Justice Project, this is an independent NGO that measures authoritarianism, a global rule of law recession, they call it, started in 2016. Civil justice systems are weakened, freedom of assembly and association, freedom of opinion and expression, and freedom of religion all declined widely in Europe. Changes in policing and the law are used to curb the right to protest. There is a distinctly more punitive approach to demonstrations. Imprisonment is used as deterrent for peaceful protests. Policing is more aggressive. In a report that the European Parliament's Committee on Civil Liberty, Justice and Home Affairs tasked me to do 2 years ago, I researched, especially I zoomed in on the situation in France, Spain, and Bulgaria, and established actually that the European Commission, the executive arm of the EU, which acquired the duty of monitoring the rule of law, so it is one of the top guardians of the rule of law together with the European Court of Justice, in fact actively condoning rule of law violations in Europe. So just to give one last example of what's going on, the Public Order Act, adopted in May 2023 in the UK, also nicknamed as the anti-protest bill, gave law enforcement agency greater powers to prevent protest. And these are things that are enacted by the mainstream parties. So the appetite for autocratic rule surpasses the far right, and the assault on basic freedom is performed by the center parties. Where am I going with that? First point to make is that analytically, the economy versus culture dichotomy does not begin to describe what's going on, let alone help us understand it or explain it. So we need to shift away from the economy versus culture divide, and in order to do that, I have relied on Max Weber's notion of life chance, and his idea that social structuration is a matter of distribution of life chances. Now, Weber introduces the term life chance to speak about, and I quote here from his Economy and Society, Volume 1, the probability of procuring goods, gaining a position in life, and finding inner satisfaction. So I find that, rather than speaking of social class in terms of these snapshots of, measurements, probability. So this definition refers to a societal shared understanding of a successful life and accomplished self, as way to also to the individual psychological experiences of such an achievement, and most importantly for me, it draws attention to perceive and anticipated things that happen with your social status. So this frame of conceptualization allows us to put the stress on perceived and anticipated impact of social dynamics on social status, rather than just measuring social status. especially through threats to livelihood, to sources of livelihood. This, however, makes it so the life chances, how do you measure it? You know, very hard to measure it, and not so spectacular to report. In my own work, I detected this phenomenon when I analyzed deliberative polls, so that technique of deliberative polling might help. Deliberative polls held in the European Parliament in 2007. They wanted to see attitudes of Europeans towards Turkish, in the Turkish accession at the time was being prepared. So I noticed that whenever participants were exposed first to debates, the sequencing of debates matters there. If participants were first exposed to debates about globalization and the impact on jobs, their attitudes to Turkey accession immediately became negative. So there is this, what I call economic xenophobia, linked to perceived and anticipated, not even real, job loss. We saw that played out very clearly with, if you remember, the Polish plumber discussion, in the French referendum campaign in 2005 on the adopting of the European Constitution. So there was like the fear of cheap labor from Eastern Europe, which actually never materialized, but it was feared and anticipated. So if we alter the perspective from an observation of static economic parameters, such as wealth and its distribution, and cultural identifiers, conservatives or liberal values, to dynamics that threatened life chances, and especially that threaten livelihoods, we get a story of social transformation that generates ubiquitous precarity as the underlying cause behind the rise of autocratic rule, with the blessing of democratic publics. So I will proceed to give you that story. But before I do so, let me briefly tell you how I understand precarity, why I do not speak of just insecurity or vulnerability or instability. Now, precarity, and I know I repeat myself from 2 years ago, but it's important to just to go through the whole logic of it. It entered dictionaries only very recently. Webster first picked it up in year 2017. The etymology, and the fact that they introduced a new word next to precariousness, which existed, indicated that there was some social phenomenon that needed a new word to describe it. So if you dig into the etymology of the word, precarious means, in Latin, means something obtained through either prayer or begging. So to be at the mercy of others. So it is not just any insecurity, it is disempowerment. So the heart of precarity is not insecurity, it's disempowerment. And keeping this in mind, based on other people's goodwill, directs attention to the political drivers of the condition. So it is not just modernity's, everything is in flux, take it and run with that. In my account, precarity is a condition of politically generated economic and social vulnerability rooted in the insecurity of livelihoods. It is experienced on individual level as incapacity to cope, but also in societal level, as we saw during the pandemic, incapacity to cope, and affects our ability as individuals and collectively as societies to manage diversity and to think long term. So see, it's a very serious condition, serious illness. Now the story, to get to this dynamic story of the production of mass precarity, starts before the Great Recession, well before that, and into the roaring 1990s. Even as economies grew in the 1980s and 90s with the neoliberal economic reforms, you're all familiar with them, I trust, economic insecurity increased under these measures of privatization of public assets, deregulation of product and labor markets, and disinvestment in public services. So we all know that story. I'm not going to present it here. I just want to say that an important policy shift aggravated this process. A shift from competition to competitiveness as a policy priority. At the beginning of the century, national competitiveness in the global economy became the top policy priority for our governments, trumping two other priorities that had been very important before: growth during the welfare capitalism and maintaining competition within unencumbered domestic markets, which was, the mantra of the new liberal 80s and 90s. This shift first became clear in the so-called Lisbon strategy of the European Union. It was adopted in year 2000. It was a 10-year action plan for economic development that pledged, and take this, to make the EU the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world for the next 10 years, 2010. So governments across the political spectrum rushed to implement, as you know, structural adjustment reforms as part of national strategies for international competitiveness. The way they did it, one of the ways they did it was also to aid specific hand-picked economic actors, those who are already best positioned to perform well in the global competition for profit. Now you will say, well, hasn't that always been the case? Well, sure, there is a long-established practice for the private sector to feed off the state's initial investment, for sure, in product development, innovation. But a peculiarity of contemporary capitalism is that public authority handpicks the companies to which it bestows this privilege. This results in the deliberate creation by the state of market monopolies, so against the principle of competition. For instance, the Airbus group in Europe, when it was set in year 2000, is a perfect example of that. How does that matter? Oh, it matters because very few players are saved from the pressures of competition in global integrated markets, and the rest of society, including the smaller companies, the not protected companies, the not hand-picked companies, are exposed to extreme pressures. So risks are accrued towards society across the capital-labor divide. It's not just labor that suffers from that. And opportunities are accrued to a handful of select winners. Now, a contributing factor in all this is European Union's institutional and policy design. Because it was set up on the principle of economic but not political integration, it proceeds as lifting barriers to trade within the Union. The easiest way to level the playing field and to integrate this vast economic space is through the principle of free market. So the EU, that's the big contradiction. It is heavily regulated, but all the regulation follows the policy logic of free markets. I like to say that this is how a raison d'économie in Europe replaces the raison d'etat, much more so, I would say, than in the US. Because prohibition of state aid, for instance, is religiously applied. It's one of the top policies in the EU. So moreover, because the euro is the main economic glue of the various countries, the EU shapes up as a project that prioritizes fiscal consolidation at the expense of social standards. The solemnly proclaimed and much celebrated European Pillar of Social Rights sounds great, but in fact it has meant, so that is the social rights are incorporated in the European treaties, but in fact it has meant the further absorption of social policy that previously belonged only to national governments into macroeconomic policy, EU macroeconomic policy. A number of observers have made the point that EU social policy is becoming increasingly subsumed to economic objectives focused on competitiveness, narrowly defined as low labor costs and stringent fiscal discipline. So the EU has subordinated social policy to free market logic. So as a result, exposure to global competition has increased pressures on almost everyone, including the highly skilled workers in state-owned companies. We can recall the wave of suicide in France Telecom in the year 2000. Yeah? But there were a lot of pressures on performance pressures there. A recent survey of nurses and doctors in the UK, I had a look over, so very well paid, respected, stable jobs. Over 50% are considering quitting because they cannot cope, because the National Health Service is underfunded. So there's a lot of, very few doctors, a lot of things to do. So job insecurity is also the reason why those with nominally stable and well-paid jobs are afraid to quit or slow down the rat race, even though they have a zillion mental health problems and family problems. Or even if they want to enjoy a leisure and family life. So while the precarity of the poor, of course, is the worst. There's no two ways about it, don't misunderstand me. There's importance in the stratification of precarities. But it's important to admit that while the precarity of the poor is expressed by debt and impoverishment, there is also the precarity of the privileged that is reflected in an epidemic of mental disorders such as burnouts and higher divorce rates. So the majority of the population, it seems to me, becomes precarious, even those with the good jobs, those we envy, the labor market insiders. The precarity, therefore, understood in this way that I describe it, emerges as a transversal social injustice that cuts across differences in social class, education, employment, and even income. Now, let me zoom in on one of the fabulous mechanisms of precarization, maybe the key, I believe. It is individual responsibilization. Now, public authority offloads responsibility to individuals and society without giving them the resources to cope. Example in the EU is the tendency for the EU decisional bodies to ask governments to increase social protection. Sounds great, but they're cutting spending. So the governments have more responsibility, but without the means to actually deliver on that responsibility. So a perfect example of what I call responsibility without power. In the UK, the Liberal Party, in their electoral promises, they put in the right to everybody to see a doctor within a week, but they're not increasing the budget for the National Health Service. So left at the whim of global markets, crushed by competitive pressures, we are weakened as individuals while being made responsible for things actually beyond our personal control. Our health, digital sovereignty, our employment and employability, the protection of the environment, and the upbringing of our children. Collectively, as societies, we're also weakened. So individually weakened, but also as societies we're weakened because public services have been starved of funds and subjected to market logic. Public authority has transferred its responsibility for the common good to individuals and markets. The austerity politics deepened all that, but they did not start it. They just consolidated the tendency. Now, is there any hope with the new industrial policy? There seems to be a shift. I don't think so, because these new industrial policies in the EU and the US, they basically consist in providing public money to specific industries again, helping them to be more competitive in the globally integrated markets in order to improve their competitiveness. This is a redistribution from society to the market entirely within the logic of what I have called in my work precarity capitalism. Now, if we find ourselves in this way, in a condition of precarity, which I defined as responsibility without power, this is the overarching harm, I believe, of our times. There is no just precarious class, as some economists tell us, like Guy Standing. He has coined the word precariat. I believe there is a precarious multitude, and with very grave political implications. Now, how is this related to the rise of autocracy within democracy? I said not just for the fringe, not just through the mainstreaming of their far-right discourse. Well, as I noted, the corollary to the responsibility without power is power without responsibility, and we have seen this happen throughout Europe. I gave you a few examples. Basically, precarity engenders new public demands for order and security, fear of job loss, of cultural estrangement, of physical insecurity, and of political disorder. So we have the four elements of new public agenda that cut across the left-right divide. This agenda is breeding anxiety, so all these dynamics I described, they bring anxiety, and public demands for security and safety, which translates into conservative and even reactionary political preferences. The more vulnerable people feel, the more they're willing to rely on political strongmen to provide instant stability. So political elites across the left-right divide are indeed responsible for such demands by increasing their stronghold on society through law and order policies. But this leads to a vicious cycle. Economic insecurity breeds autocratic attitudes that propel strongmen to power, whose assault on the rule of law further disempowers citizens, leaving them at the mercy of despots, a tendency at work even in the mature democracies. Now, there is no other country that illustrates this better than the UK. It's a textbook of this development. I'll wrap it up. Job insecurity and impoverished public services, especially in healthcare, are creating massive anxiety, which the ruling establishment channels into anti-foreign sentiment very actively. There has been a sustained push for the suspension of human rights because of the immigration fears. Suella Braverman, until recently the UK Home Secretary, has proposed the UK to quit the European Court of Justice, which enforces the Charter of Human Rights, because, as she put it, the Charter is at odds with British values. So, what British values? The European Court of Justice, that's the quote, is at odds with British values. Earlier, in 2022, as Attorney General, and that's the UK's chief law officer, she declared that the UK must curb the influence of European human rights rules in order, quote, to curb a burgeoning industry of highly paid equalities officers. So the country that invented the notion of universal and unconditional rights, of rule of law, is actively demolishing it. Now, I believe I have made my point. There is more to say, much more to say. What I want to observe is that we're inhabiting a very important junction, point in history, that combines this curious phenomenon of fear of change, because precarity nurtures fear of change. At the same time, there's a mass discontent with this system. So we have an opportunity there. And it's up to us academics also to participate in finding the way out. Thank you.
Well, we have about a half hour. just an observation, first question, that just occurred to me as I listened to your presentation. And it seems to me that there's a feature of the precarity you describe which makes it a bigger problem for people who are previously secure. Whereas if you're at the bottom of the economic ladder, it's a customary state. And you have coping mechanisms, even it's not a surprise. But whereas if you once believed in the welfare state and the security system and the protection of you as a certain national entity against, and you discover that all of those protections are crumbling, that's where the political consciousness begins to cut.
Yeah, totally. That is why I put the stress on perceived and anticipated, because you need to be afraid that you have something to lose. Yeah, a fear of social sliding.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, great. Open to questions and comments.
Okay, wow, thank you. That was really, really wonderful and fascinating. And I don't know anything about Europe, but I've got a million questions. So I'm gonna try to narrow myself to two. The first one is like the humanities or the humanist question, and it's around when you said these things are very difficult to measure. And so I'm just interested, okay, so anxiety, fear, a whole range of feelings that we could call public feelings are kind of undergirding the argument. How do you find them? Like, where are they expressed? What are the genres? What are the archives for the affective register of precarity? Or like, what are the cultural productions of the precariat?
What are the cultural
productions of the precariat? Where can we see the precariat's feelings in a way that we don't see them in surveys or so the problem of the measurement.
Yeah.
And then relatedly, it reminded me of a whole sort of strand of mostly US feminist political theory. So I'm thinking of Wendy Brown, Lauren Berlant, particularly Lauren Berlant's, I think it's 2011, Cruel Optimism, which is a book about how, and she doesn't really theorize precarities. In a way, she's interested more in the internal state of why do people stay attached to imaginings of life chances that actually hurt them. So I would use that to ask a little bit, but how does the Weber life chances thing work with the power without responsibility, responsibility without power, and how do we measure it?
Great questions. Great questions. How we cannot really measure, but we can detect. So, as I said, this deliberative polls, you can see shifts of attitude according to what people were exposed to as information. I listened to the way the Gilets jaunes discussed. So there were public debates, consultation, and the government started a consultation. They collected people's narratives. I listened to those, and people were really talking about the fear that if the government increases the tax on petrol, they cannot afford to have a car. But without that, they cannot go to work. So, and then this was reflected in the newspapers through inequality. Nobody was mentioning inequality on the street, but journalists use immediately that language because it's available. I think surveys can detect, but we cannot measure. A lot of work needs to be done there by social science. Wendy Brown has written on precarity, but she, for her, to be precarious, you have to be less well than another. So there is the comparative aspect as well. The rest, I will just take a note of that Very, very good idea. I will incorporate that. Thank you. Yeah. For the Weber, it will take me longer to answer, but I will. Yeah. Okay. Let's be in conversation about this then. Good.
Hello. I know you talked about like the rightward shift in Europe and like the limiting of like human rights and civil rights. And I was wondering, I noticed like there was like I've been kind of sometimes keep up with like the recent elections, and I was wondering if you thought like the election in like Poland and Spain, when there was kind of a shift to the more of a center, is that indicative of kind of Europe shifting away from the far right, you feel like, or do you think those two are not really significant of a continental change?
Look, I think that what's becoming clear is that these promises from the of appeasing people's fears through stopping immigration, people just see that it's not working. So there is a little bit of waking up to the fact that these policies that, but this is too new. I don't think, the jury is still out, I would say.
I have a question, actually. If a favored proposal of your Silicon Valley venture capitalists and tech billionaires is this idea of the universal basic income as a panacea for all of the sort of precarity and insecurity that you're talking about. And I know that Europe actually has some experimental examples of implementing that in some of the countries in Europe. So I was wondering whether or not you see something like an income guarantee or a universal basic income as something that's capable of solving the problems you note.
Okay. I would not endorse the universal basic income, although I would take the money anytime. But I still will not advise it as policy. Now, if we have more money to spend, we should spend it on public services, because no matter how rich you are or how equal our societies become, nobody will be rich individually, sufficiently rich to secure for themselves a good public health care, because that requires enormous investment in research, equipment, delivery. So if we have money, let's build the commons up. Yeah.
I'll have one. Thank you so much. And it's fun to see where this has come and where you're going with it. And I know you said that you're presenting this at the
Ligue des droits de l'homme next
in
week.
France. And so I just thought we could maybe talk a little bit about the end of the talk a little bit,
Yes.
and what you're trying to do with the example in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Partly because I think you're right that the repeal, although now they've said they're not going to repeal the Human Rights Act. I mean, it seemed like it was absolutely going to happen.
Absolutely,
and then just
yeah,
a couple of months ago,
yeah.
it turns out it's probably not. But I mean, but there's been a move on the part of some to do that for a long time. So it's not just Susan Braverman, right?
No.
But I'm wondering, so given that, I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what you want to say about that. So the European Court of Human Rights, I mean, in the UK, partly it's because of I think it is very much related to the policing and the increased surveillance and the protection that comes from greater policing, and not wanting, in a sense, that human rights is going to push back against that. I actually have a whole other project that says human rights supports all of that, but I don't think that that's what they're imagining in the UK. So I just wanted to hear you sing, I guess, a few more lines of the tune of the relationship between the
economic precarity,
concerns
and
about I guess the critiques of human rights and the rise of precarity, and like why are you situating it now in this moment as opposed to the 90s where you were wanting to push earlier?
Difficult question. Thank you, though. But this is exactly what I want to go. So it's also a matter of evidence. So since 2016, there has been a massive shift in laws. For instance, in France, there have been, the laws of increasing the powers of the police. So what I believe is happening, you're asking me of what is the connection, to clarify the connection between the two, because they seem to,
The next connection would be why only UK, so.
Oh, no. I just gave an example because I wanted to be specific. Actually, in my report for the Libe committee of the European Parliament, I deal with France and Spain, not with just I had these examples from Britain that seem to be very clear. So I think it's very easy. It's much easier for political elites after the after the privatization of such big sectors of the economy that destabilized our lives, to tell us that they're going to provide security through physical control, through non-economic means, because what would it take for companies to go back in public hands? It will be so expensive. Nobody's even the left is not talking much about that. So there is no, I think, available plausible economic policy, or they're not willing to propose dramatic shifts in economic policy. So these are shortcuts, I believe, into providing this kind of securitization steps that crush the right to protest, mostly increase police powers. So that would be, for the time being, my answer. Yeah.
Second question, which is inspired by yours, actually. And that is the question about the origin of this particular ideology and the moment that it happened, Lisbon 2000, where, among other things, President Clinton was present on the scene. And I just wonder to what extent there is a transatlantic infusion of the libertarian spirit of and the Silicon Valley sort of ethos or cult, if you like, of the information and knowledge economy, taking Europe in some sense by storm and by a fit of jealousy and perhaps misunderstanding of what it actually was or wasn't in the United States. So in some sense, we're seeing a kind of symbiotic or I don't know, parallel play phenomenon between European and American elites on this matter, in which the original force is actually out in California and to some extent here.
I think that actually the first competition between the U.S. and Europe on the new digitalized economy was for entry into the Chinese market, wasn't it? When they were competing, which broadband standard would become the universal one, and then Clinton really pushed for the American one to dominate. In the book I mentioned that story, but I have forgotten the details. The transatlantic infusion of the libertarian spirit, you put it very well. And what we are seeing is this very nefarious competition between the US and Europe. Rather than cooperating on setting different standards, they're actually competing and therefore undermining each other.
What I remember at the time was just a wave of enthusiasm.
Oh,
the concept
yes.
of innovation, just as a kind of
Yeah.
And you're going to innovate by imitating the United States. This is not exactly. I understand what innovation is.
But that was what Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapello called the new spirit of capitalism. That was the sexy capitalism that we were all, libertarian spirit. We were supposed to work, make millions by the pool, and bask in the sun. But now actually people are motivated by fear. So now this is the enthusiasm is actually replaced by fear. Also, in terms of social policy, if you look how the discourse it has shifted from, working standards, working conditions, to resilience, to employability. So this is a very negative spirit of capitalism. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I missed something or I didn't understand correctly, but this equation, precarity as predictor of populism and authoritarian regimes, at least coming from the global south, it doesn't it doesn't work in the global south. Either because in the global south we've been living in precarity for centuries. That's one. Yeah. But even the term precarity started to be used 40 years ago, and is not a predictor of populism or authoritarian regimes, nor it doesn't predict if it will be a left or right government. So I don't know if it's very unique to the European region, or is something that it doesn't work globally because it doesn't resonate.
No, great question, and I am happy to confirm you're right. This is not a story that it's supposed to fit everywhere. This is the European story, maybe the American story, and as Jamie Galbraith noted, it is about it only works where you have had some kind of stability and you're afraid that you're sensing that you're about to lose that stability. Societies that have been deeply precarious, no, that my story doesn't fit there. So I do not pretend that this is a universal story. And these kind of studies have to be conducted in Latin America, in different contexts. I'm only now focused on Europe. But the fact that it doesn't fit Latin America doesn't disprove me. That doesn't make me wrong about Europe.
Great presentation. It's good.
Yes, please.
I knew you had one, Neville.
Well, I mean, there are many. Okay, I'm not American. I'm originally South African, but I'm now a citizen, and I've lived here for a long time. So part of me resonates strongly with. Okay, South Africa has an electricity crisis through a public-funded company, and there's unbelievable nepotism in there. So, and everybody's thinking if we privatize, it'll get better. It won't get better, but staying public is not working either. But I heard many resonances. I mean, a lot of what you said about strongmen applies to Trump. We've lived through it.
Yeah.
But I just want to end on a little moment of optimism.
Okay, good.
Which is actually, I think, what's happening to policing in this country right now is it's actually under attack. So there's been a big movement to defund the police. It's been resisted. But so there are.
There's a pushback.
So there's pushback, and there are different kinds of racially stratified, cross-stratified social movements that ebb and flows. I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think there is in this country like a big pushback against the fantasy of carceral logics as a solution, that they're not going to make us more secure.
Right. Yeah. Well, so in Europe as well. I mean, look, France. There have been protests. There's so much mobilization in France, and yet what happens? The government doesn't budge. So, and why is France the most belligerent of all the European countries? I think so far they have been the least precarious. They have more sense of agency. Wait for another, decade of reforms, and nobody would be on the streets because they're too tired from working. Yeah.
Since Jamie pushed me a little bit, have you looked at levels of public investment when they change in a country and see if that's a
Yeah,
I mean, I know the UK
absolutely,
very well,
it is, it is.
because the public investment as a percentage of GDP went down dramatically, and it's 22%.
Yeah.
And over time, when you're not investing in
Yeah,
schools and,
yeah,
and health and roads, something happens.
yeah,
So it's,
yeah.
but to link that to fear of the unknown, that's an old English thing, by the way. It's not a new thing.
No, no, but there's also Eric
Always
Fromm.
felt something different. So,
Absolutely clear. I mean, level of public investment matters. But also the setup of public policy. Let me give this example I like to give often to illustrate this. So in 2018, the European Commission said, let's develop anti-COVID vaccine. They knew it's coming. They didn't know in what form. So the European Commission, the executive arm of the union, says, yeah, let's do something about public health. But they proposed that within a private-public entity, together with Big Pharma. That entity is called Innovative Medicine Initiative. It's supposed to invest in cutting-edge stuff of public investment. And then Big Pharma said, well, no, thanks, it's not going to be profitable because it might never happen. So it's also the logic, the market logic that dominates, investment decisions. So you're right, public investment, level of investment, but I would also think it's the institutional setup of decision making that matters.
well, I thought in England it happened because there was a conservative government which has been in power for a very long time, and they had different views on it. But whether they have demonstrated that effectively, apart from running the country down, it's difficult to see that.
Yeah.
So that's, I just wanted to raise that.
Yeah, very, very much on the spot.
Okay.
All right.